Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I tried my best there to look surprised, as Phil usually would, just so that you're not let down by that. Phil is unable to join us this evening, so you have myself. So yeah, welcome for those who are new to Critical Witness, and welcome back to those who usually listen in or will be listening to a future recording. So tonight I'm going to be joined by Nathan Bossoh, and I should actually check with you, Nathan, whether I'm going to let me get you up on screen, whether I actually I forgot to ask how I pronounce your second name, and I was going on the countdown. I was thinking I forgot to ask you to say it, so I apologise if I've done harm to that.
That's all right. It's Bossoh, but people say different things. You're pretty close, to be fair. I've heard Bossoh. Some different stuff, so
that wasn't too bad. Well, anyway, welcome. Really looking forward to chatting with you. And I guess very quickly, just in a minute, give us a rundown about your journey to where we are today, like how long you've been a Christian, a little bit about what you're up to nowadays, and then we can get into the sort of nitty and gritty of the sort of history of science and religion. Is that all right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, my name's Nathan Bossoh. I've been a Christian since birth, really. So my parents are pastors of church that I go to. I'm in Mitcham. It's called Eden Pentecostal Church. And I kind of grew up as a musician. So my background is as a musician. So in the arts, I should say I'm based in London as well. Croydon area, which is technically not London, but I just say it's London anyway. But
London Borough,
yeah, exactly. So my kind of background is that as a musician, as a bass player, and my family were musicians as well, and stuff like that. So that kind of history. I went to study music at university, 2011 maybe, I think so. So it's like a good 10 years now. Then I worked as a kind of musician for quite a while, mainly in London, but I did some other work with a couple of artists and bands and stuff like that. And just various things for a number of years. And then in short, brief story, how I kind of switched to the kind of doing what I'm doing now as a PhD student in the history of science and religion. Was really at the end of university. It's actually quite a weird story, but I watched randomly on YouTube. I came across, when I was at my university I came across this video by a channel called Veritasium, Derek Muller, the science channel, which many people will probably know. And it was the video was called something like "Can you go faster than the speed of light?" And I watched that video for no reason at all. I had no interest in physics up until then. And quite literally, that video kind of got me interested quite specifically in questions to do with science. From then, I just kind of delved more and more into these kind of things. And then I started to think about my faith in relation to science. And then this notion of conflict, which was very common. I'd heard it growing up. In terms of evolutionary theory, dinosaurs and all that stuff. I think all those questions start to compile from 2014 to about 2017. So I was studying at home on my own whilst I was a musician full time. And eventually 2017, I basically just decided that I wanted to reverse my roles because I got so engaged in studying science, theology, philosophy, history. And I decided to do a master's degree in Edinburgh University online, a course called Philosophy, Science and Religion. And then from there, I discovered that history was really the area that I wanted to kind of understand these things. So that's how I ended up at UCL, where I currently am essentially doing my PhD in the history of science and religion. That's basically it in short.
Great. No, it's cool. It sounds like an interesting journey from musician to historian of science. What did you? I guess in terms of like making that decision, did you what gave you, was there any sort of, you had any caution about going into sort of exploring science in detail, and were you concerned about how that would affect your faith, whether there was any conflict between science and Christianity, or were you just open to kind of exploring? And
I think for me, yeah, personally, I was open to exploring, but as we were talking about before, because not many of my friends were kind of into it, I felt quite alone, I might say, in going into it. And even, for my parents, it's not something that they necessarily kind of delved into. So it was a bit difficult for them to even understand. So I wanted to go into it. I was really kind of interested, but it was a bit of a lonely journey in a sense. But yeah, I think that's really, yeah. The conflict stuff, yes, to an extent. I mean, some of the first videos that I was watching was actually the whole creation evolution debate. So especially particularly young Earth creationists versus how it's typically termed young Earth creationists versus evolutionists, and obviously that has is a whole thing to unpack. But from then I kind of discovered that there were more thinkers outside of that debate. So Christian thinkers like John Lennox is is an obvious example. William Lane Craig, so forth and so on. So yeah, I'd say that's kind of the general journey that I think I just wanted to answer some questions is the key thing. I just really want to ask some questions then. So I kind of just tried to push through.
No, essentially, I mean, I can sympathize with, I think for any Christian often, and not necessarily just Christians as well, but when you want to kind of explore one particular area in depth, it can often be quite lonely, because even within the church, you might not, even though I've always hoped, someone is interested in sort of theology, philosophy, and primarily ethics. Very rarely, you'd think Christians really want to be, you should be at the forefront of, of exploring these topics. But you actually very seldom come into contact with people who have similar interests.
Right.
And so, you do often feel very lonely. So just to say, it's not just with people, historians, it's I think it's a lot of areas that I think Christians, until they actually find themselves at the university and other people who might be studying at the university, but actually within the church often, which is is not always ideal. And I think it does depend what kind of kind of church you're in, what area you're in, where you live, about the likelihood of that. But like you, I grew up in South London as well, and not a hotbed necessarily of sort of Christian sort of intellectualism and interest in history, philosophy, and ethics, and those kinds of things. So I can sympathise with that. I guess it would be interesting. What already sort of talked about how you go into the history of science. But what is the history of science for people that don't necessarily know?
That's a difficult question. History of science is trying to how is best to define it? I think the issue with trying to talk about the history of science is that science itself isn't one thing, and it's never really been one thing. So when someone asks a historian about science, we always kind of hesitate, because for us, we see history as evolving over time. So in a sense, history of science, you say trying to kind of understand, the human knowledge in terms of you say discoveries that human beings have made, and inventions, and all of that stuff. But that's an inadequate definition, I would say. So the kind of modern definition of science is like systematic knowledge of the modern world. But that wasn't the definition of science, say in the Middle Ages. Whereas in the Middle Ages, the understanding of science was general organized knowledge. So with that being said, that's why I say it's quite difficult to kind of understand what the history of science is. But yeah, I think we'd have to kind of unpack that kind of as one goes.
Yeah, so you're kind of more focused. So if I understand, you're studying George Campbell. Could you? It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about. All I know is that he's a British sort of polymath, and we can talk a bit about polymaths. I have a real interest in polymaths, so I imagine you will as well. So I guess it'd be interesting. What made you want to explore the life, the views and things of George Campbell? And was he a Christian? Like, who is he? It'd be interesting to find out a bit more about him.
Yeah, George. He was the eighth. He was known as the eighth Duke of Argyll. So he was an aristocrat in the 19th century, a British aristocrat in the 19th century, a Scottish one, I should say, in particular, Presbyterian, Church of Scotland. And yeah, he was a polymath. So in the 19th century Britain, polymaths were becoming quite rare. It was a time where specialism was becoming the norm, one could say. But he was a polymath in the sense that he was involved in numerous areas. So as an aristocrat and someone who was interested in the sciences, and as a Christian, he was involved in everything from ornithology, so study of birds, to engineering feats. Even though he didn't necessarily do engineering himself, but he provided spaces, you could say, an institutional support to engineering feats in places like India, which brings in questions of the empire, of course. He actually played a really critical role in the development of British India from the 1860s onwards. He was involved in geology, so ornithology and geology were probably his main two areas. And then things like evolutionary theory, he also got involved in from about 1850 onwards. Anthropology, which is, you could say, the study of humankind and human culture, human beings and human culture. Again, what else? The comparative study of religion. He was involved in trying to understand like the origin of religions, essentially. So yeah, just multiple areas of kind of science, and he was also a politician on top of that. So he's a bit of a difficult character to study, to be honest, because he did so many things. It's really quite challenging to pin down one particular thing, and I have to like often leave out a lot of what he did. But yeah, polymath in the 19th century, a Christian polymath in the 19th century who got involved in all these. He considered himself a philosopher more so than a scientist, I would say. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, being a rich Victorian guy really did allow you to explore all your interests, didn't it? And it's fascinating. Like like you said, unfortunately, we don't really get many polymaths anymore. Not at least in the. I guess, but just for people who are polymaths, people who contribute sort of new knowledge to multiple different areas. And like Nathan, like you were saying, isn't it? I mean, now everything's very specialist. You become a biologist, but you're not just a biologist. You focus on a particular minute area of biology, and so it's much more difficult, isn't it? Because there's so much knowledge around as well. Like any area, sort of moves slightly out of your area, and you're like, "Gosh, I've got like 10. I've got 200 years worth of knowledge to try and to try and understand before I try and contribute anything new." Whereas I guess going back 100 plus years, 150 plus years, there wasn't quite. Things were, people were identifying and finding out new things at quite a rapid pace. It must have been such a great time to have the resources and the interests to really, to do that. Must have been amazing.
I mean, it was quite difficult for him, I would say. There's good and bad points, but for him, because as I said, at that time, of course, he was becoming quite a rarity. Because there was such an explosion of knowledge, at least going by traditional, history of science, in this area, there was such an explosion of knowledge that it was becoming difficult for one person. So, what we see today was becoming a reality in the second half of the 19th century, when these new fields were completely opening up. And again, a lot of that was to do with the fact that in Britain, at least, the British Empire was so expansive at that time that it could do these investigations across the world, whereas obviously other parts of the world were not able to do that. And he was himself certainly a part of that kind of tradition. So not just British science, but science within the empire. But it did allow him to, as you say, contribute new forms of knowledge or new ways of thinking that maybe a specialist at that time might not have been able to see, and that's what he was trying to do. He was more interested in like the philosophy that kind of underpinned the science, and how that all related to him as a Christian, how that all related to kind of theology and Christianity and belief in God. So, a lot of what he was doing, he was trying to kind of relate that back to his faith in the end.
Right. What have you? I guess I'm interested. I mean, he seems like he seems obscure in a sense. Like obviously, history of science is so broad and wide. What made you want to focus on him? Someone that probably 99.999% of people have never heard of. And I guess as well, on top of that, like what have you learned? Like what's been sort of valuable in terms of this sort of studying him? I'd be interested to know.
Well, yeah, no, I came into him almost accidentally, to be honest. With as you'll probably be aware of, when you're trying to find a PhD subject, you need to find something niche that you can kind of focus on in your field. So when I was doing my master's, I was kind of looking through the historical literature. And I was interested in, as with many Christians, evolution is the big thing that Christians are either concerned about or not concerned about, or whatever. You kind of understand where I'm going, and with that, and most people are aware of that. So it was the same thing for me. I was really interested in understanding kind of the history of evolutionary theory. And George Douglas Campbell, the 8th Duke of Argyll, is quite a prominent figure in those debates, because he was a contemporary of Darwin, friend of Darwin, and they debated and discussed all of this type of stuff. They had, slightly different views, but they weren't antagonistic towards each other in that sense. They were good friends. So yeah, it was. I kind of just saw his name, propping up every now and again when I was reading the literature. So when I was reading books by historians of science and religion, and then I recognize, okay, so this guy is around. Nobody's done comprehensive work on him, so I can use him as a case study to understand evolution. And then when I actually started working on him, I found out he was a polymath after I had discovered his link to evolution. So the polymath part was just completely by accident. I had no idea that was even going to be what I studied. But it's been useful in the sense, useful and challenging. Useful in the sense that because I don't really have a particular area that I focus on, some people are historians of biology or historians of physics, or something in particular, or anthropology, or whatever that the case might be. I can't really say that about myself because he was a polymath, and because there was not really anything he kind of specialized on. So for me, it's more a general-ish picture of the history of science and religion. The challenge with that, as you rightly stated, is that there's so much to uncover that it's almost impossible kind of to feel like you have a grasp on it all. And obviously, I've only been doing this for about 2 or 3 years now, as a PhD student. So I still feel like I'm, a baby in the grand scheme of things. There are professors who've been doing this for 30, 40 years. And here I am, studying this polymath and trying to cram as much knowledge as I can get in. So it's useful and it's challenging at the same time.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I guess you'll get all those skills to kind of develop your own area of expertise as you move forward. Well, I guess I'd be interested. What was, in terms of, was anything unique about his views of how evolution, natural selection, evolution by natural selection, and Darwin kind of affected his view of Christianity, of God? Obviously, because a lot of people, you've got people like Alfred Russel Wallace, was a Christian who co-discovered,
he wasn't a Christian, however.
Was he not a Christian?
No, he wasn't a Christian.
See, I always thought he was. So there you go. That's the historian correcting me there. So I appreciate that. I'm sure I'd read somewhere that Alfred Russel Wallace was a Christian. Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, he was a theist, but not a Christian. He was a spiritualist, let's say. So he believed in some sort of thing out there, but he certainly wasn't a Christian, a traditional Christian.
Okay. That's interesting, though, because I've definitely read several things where he's described as a Christian, but probably websites. So that'll be interesting. Yeah, so that'll be interesting. So thank you for that. But again, I guess moving on to like himself as a Christian, like what did it change his views? Did it challenge his views? Like did he see it as a sort of conflict with his beliefs, or something that sort of supplemented
evolutionary
them?
theory? This is where it gets obviously really, really complicated, because there are so many views when Darwin obviously and Alfred Russel Wallace, well, when Darwin publishes his work, but obviously, as you said, Alfred Russel Wallace was the kind of co-discoverer of evolutionary theory. For Argyll, he didn't have so much of a problem with the theory in general. He had the same problem that loads of people had with it, that the vast majority of people had with it, was that the process of natural selection couldn't explain the entire diversity of animals and humans. And obviously, as a theist, the other option for many theists was theistic evolution. So one could obviously be a Christian and accept evolutionary theory, and just suggest that obviously God was behind the mechanism of evolution, which is exactly what the Duke of Argyll did. So he was happy to accept the theory. The only other distinction that he made was that he felt that humans and animals were separate. So humans, humans did extend back beyond, let's say, the traditional Protestant view of about 5 to 6,000 years ago, 6 to 10,000 years ago, however one wants to frame it. He was happy to see an antiquity with man, so extending back for many years. I've lost my train of thought now.
So go on.
Yeah, well, so he was happy to see that, but yeah, as I said, he wanted to have God essentially in the mix.
Right.
But it was also, that I think that's the main stuff with him.
So this is kind of modern, well, at least in the UK, I think you look at sort of survey data, as a lot of Christians in terms of evolution don't really see it as an issue. They just sort of, sounds like you add God to it. There was this process, but actually it was guided by God.
Right.
Through its sort of causally and.
And I should say, that was the other thing I was going to say as well. The origin of life as well was obviously another aspect. So obviously for him, the idea that the origin of life could be explained via this naturalistic process was obviously a reason why he could kind of implement God into the mix. So that was the other part of it as well, which again, most, pretty much all theists said that as well. So nothing too unusual there.
Yeah. Oh, I can't remember. It was a priest. I can't remember the name, but the way they kind of described it, a Victorian priest, it was like, God created the world to create itself. How they kind of understood that kind of unfolding, through that process.
Quite literally,
yeah. I guess you've said the word conflict, so I'm sort of easy to sort of segue into. I think a lot of people. Christians and non-Christians do see through history that there has been this they're led to believe that there is this sort of historical conflict between Christianity and science, and if I'm not mistaken, it's sort of that they call it, historians of science call it the conflict thesis, don't they? And it was two guys, John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White. Were kind of responsible in their books of promoting this conflict between science on the one hand and theology, specifically Christianity. What in terms of your understanding sort of Christianity and science throughout history, is there any sort of truth to that, or has theology historically been at war with Christianity, or was that not necessarily the case?
That's the big question. That's a large part of the reason why so many historians got into this field. And there's a lot to say, because there's a lot of research that's now been done. The first thing I would say, and I can kind of expand on this, is that Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper, historians used to think that they were the people that invented the conflict thesis between science and Christianity. Turns out that's not necessarily the truth. And one of my friends who might be watching, might not be, I'm not too sure, academic colleague called James Ungarianu, who has probably done the most recent research on this, where he revises that view, and he's showing that these two figures, who are university lecturers in America, were not actually the constructors of this narrative. This narrative had been popular, or it had been around before these two. They were actually trying to construct a harmony thesis actually between science and Christianity. But in the process of doing that, what they did was try to drop all the negative aspects of science and Christianity. And most people basically took that part of the book, took the conflict aspects of the book, and almost neglected the harmony part of the book that they were actually trying to promote. And that's what's led to our kind of understanding of the kind of conflict thesis now. Their books happen to be the most popular for promoting that, but they themselves were liberal Christians. They had slightly different views, as James Ungarianu would be able to explain much better. Draper's book, which came out in 1870s, Draper was more interested in going back to a sort of Protestant Reformation rationalist Christianity, whereas Andrew Dixon White, who was him and Ezra Cornell were the founders of Cornell University in 1865, I think it was more of a liberal Christianity in the kind of feelings realm. So for him, he was all about kind of progressive Christianity and this kind of feelings type element to kind of Christianity. So James Ungarianu usually says that Draper Christianity was a thing of the head, and for Andrew Dixon White, Christianity was a thing of the heart. But either way, they were both liberal Christians. Their narratives of conflict in their popular books in the 1870s and the 1890s were taken up by atheists, secularists towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And it was really these people, one of the main culprits being Charles Bradlaugh, who was in fact, he was the most prominent atheist in the late 19th century. He became an MP for Northampton in the 1880s, but he was denied his seat because he was a proclaimed atheist until about 1886. So there's a whole dispute there. So just like you have, your Richard Dawkins today and kind of the really popular names, Charles Bradlaugh was like the equivalent, you could say, in that period. And he was really a person that promoted, well, there were loads of them, but he was one of the people took the ideas of Draper and White, at least the conflict part of their book, not the harmony part, and promoted it. And that's at least one of the reasons where this kind of conflict thesis develops from. There's much to it. As to go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that one of the things I've always found really fascinating is the role the Reformation played, because a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the anti-science kind of common myths that we hear are rooted in this Protestant animus against Catholics, and it's really fascinating. You realise, only going back a couple of years ago, realising that actually a lot of these things are rooted in the Reformation. So we were attacking Catholics, but actually throughout history has got kind of reformed as Christianity is fundamentally in conflict with science, and it's fascinating. There's so many things just seem to me to be rooted in the Reformation. It's fascinating. So you're right. Yeah, those guys certainly popularized it, but a lot of the most common myths seem to be based in the Reformation. I don't know whether that's the case or not.
That's exactly what James Ungarianu's book is called, Science and Religion in the Protestant Tradition, I think, if I'm not mistaken. That's exactly what his book argues.
I didn't know that, so I haven't read his book, so I'll if I agree with him, then I'll have to. I'll have
it's
to,
exactly as you say. quite literally, you've got it, man. That's precisely what, and some people can trace it even further back. People like Tom Holland, the more popular historian, he would in a different sort of way, but he'll trace it back all the way to the Old Testament, and he shows how there's been a reversal of thinking, where in the Old Testament, many of the Hebrew prophets were telling the nations around them that their polytheism was false and our belief in the one true God was true. So our belief in Yahweh, was the true belief, and your polytheism is not the truth. By the 19th century, obviously, you get a reversal. So you have atheist secularists now telling theists that your belief is superstitious. It's not true. We have the rational position. We have the scientific position. We have the truth. So he traces it like that. But James Ungurianu takes a mid position where, he kind of links it back, as you rightly said, to the Protestant Reformation, where for the Protestants, they were really trying to obviously carve a space for themselves as kind of presenting true Christianity, and they had to, of course, show why Catholicism was false. So they attacked multiple things, Catholic miracles and the authority of the church. Obviously, most people are aware of sola scriptura, the authority of the Pope, and just a whole bunch of things. Many of the early church councils and stuff like that, and they really kind of made this image of the Dark Ages, which is another myth, of course.
Yeah.
Because as many historians now, to mention two of them, Seb Falk is a really good one, who's written a book called The Light Ages. James Hannam is another good one, who's written a book called Philosophers. Right, yeah. So we, as historians, we're well aware now that that's not true. Like the Middle Ages was not anywhere near the Dark Ages. The science of that period was very advanced. And all of that stuff. But at the Protestant Reformation, obviously Protestants created that image of the Catholics. And then what happens is by the 18th century, this is a very kind of generalized version of it. But by the 18th century, with the Enlightenment period, you have liberal Christians starting to attack Protestant Christians because they're saying that Protestant Christians haven't gone far enough. They're still a bit too orthodox. So it's just a lot of infighting within the church. And then this kind of new liberal kind of Christian narrative, shifts into the 19th century. And then, as you rightly said, by the 19th century, what you then have is, again, secularists attacking all of Christianity. So it starts, as you say, with Protestants attacking Catholics. And then by the 19th century, it's secularists attacking Christians. And the secularists are weaponizing science because science has just, in a sense, been codified, you could say, in the 19th century. So the understanding of science, as another historian called Peter Harrison has shown, that our understanding of modern science develops in the 19th century. So prior to the 19th century, you don't really have the understanding of science that we have. I mean, it's that these secularists are able to kind of weaponize and codify and use that as a way to attack Christianity. But again, the actual idea of this conflict is false because it was a narrative that was constructed to make Christians look bad. That was the sole purpose of the narrative for secularists and atheists. Draper, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, it's been very successful because I would say within the sort of cultural consciousness of the West, there is this massive disconnect between professional historians, historians of science, and then the general public who generally do believe in things like the Dark Ages, that Christians taught the Earth was flat, and that Columbus thought he was going to sail away and fall off the edge of the Earth. I mean, but these things are just understood to be self-evidently the case, right. And but obviously within professional academia, that's obviously not the case.
Yeah.
Why do you think they've stuck around? I mean, are we not doing a very good job, do you think, dispelling those myths, or is it our responsibility to do so? Is that someone like yours role? You as someone who's training, is that something you see yourself, part of your role to dispel some of those myths for both the secular world and Christians as well?
Yeah, I mean, partly again, that's almost the whole reason why I personally kind of went into it. Now I would say I have slightly different views of what I'd like to do, but certainly I recognize this big disparity, as you've rightly said, between the field, when nobody in our field, thinks even, considers that idea of conflict. We got past that like 30 years ago, and even beyond that, with John Hedley Brooks' book. He's like one of the leading historians in our field, called a book in 1991 called Science, Religion, Some Historical Perspectives. And that book really set the tone for where historians are kind of at now. And we're kind of expanding beyond that now. But certainly in the public domain, the idea is still prevalent. And the reasons for that are complicated. Once again, I would have to probably point to James Ungurianu and Dave Hutchins. I don't know if you know. Do you know Dave Hutchins by any chance?
I think I added him on Facebook. I think because you recommended the, I think a while back, the book, and I added it to my Amazon wish list.
Oh yeah.
And I think he was one of the. Was he a co-author or a book you contributed or something like that? And so I added it to my Amazon wish list. So I added him as a friend when I saw you tagged him.
Yeah,
he seems really interesting.
Yeah, they've written another more popular version of James Ungurianu's academic book, which talks about all of this stuff. So I haven't read the full thing yet, but because it's not out in this country as of yet. But that so they'll have some good reasons. But of course, some of the basic reasons are that it's easy to believe. It's a simple kind of narrative to believe. Instead of believing complexity, which is what most historians would kind of go by. Any historical interaction is complex. That's the basic fundamental of just doing history. Even the Duke of Argyll, I'm studying one guy, and his life is crazy complicated. But the other thing that other historians might point out is identity. So for many people and many worldviews, let's say, it could just be a part of their identity. So an obvious example is Richard Dawkins, again, new atheists, but also I'd say like I'm sure you're aware of the kind of new internet atheists as well, like Alex O'Connor, Stephen Woodford, Drew McCoy, all of these guys who are now doing it on the internet. I'd say they're a bit more nuanced than the old new atheists, but they still more or less, Alex O'Connor has tried to do some history of Galileo and stuff like that. Still gets it wrong, and it's like the information is out there, but these guys almost have to see it as part of their identity. And that's not my argument, that's an argument from Peter Harrison. But I think it is quite true. So I think it's not just about the evidence. Human beings, we don't just go by evidence. We obviously go by feelings, emotions. Human beings are quite irrational, and we like to think that we're very rational, but really our worldview shape a lot of what we believe. Psychologists, cognitive scientists, will tell you that straight up. So ease of believing in that narrative, the difficulty of understanding the truth is another thing. But, for me, I've had to go, I've had to do a PhD to try and understand this stuff, and not saying that everyone has to do that, of course, but it is complicated to understand the truth of what has happened, historically speaking. And then identity as the kind of third reason.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess going on from what you said, like people are motivated to reason. Motivated reasoning is kind of involved, because if you don't want something to be true, like if you don't want Christianity to be true, it's much easier to be motivated to embrace things that make it more difficult to embrace Christianity as being rooted in truth. It's always struck me sort of low-hanging fruit, rather than doing the work to try and dig into it. One person I would say, I'm sure you come across Tim O'Neill, who runs the History for Atheists.
Yeah.
So he is great.
Yeah,
he's like a godsend. Like we Christians should like pray for him and thank God for him, because he just does such an amazing job at just addressing all of these myths that a lot of atheists, popular atheists, and even atheist scientists and philosophers, will repeat some of these claims, and which are totally atheist, just untrue, and he does such a fantastic job. So if anyone listening, if you come across his blog is called, or website is called History for Atheists, and he's just, unfortunately they are very long blog posts, but
Yes,
they
yeah.
are fantastic. I mean, he's one hell of a
He
historian. He
has
does
the
such a
YouTube page
fantastic
as
job.
well,
Right.
which is useful. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I should. Oh, go ahead.
no. I was just saying. Yeah, I was just saying he does a very good job.
I was going to say that. So, as a historian, I have to be quite fair, and so as much as I, will critique secularists, I also have to critique Christians ourselves because we've
Yeah.
also not done a good job. In not everybody, but one of the problems I've noticed with Christians themselves is, okay, so Christians aren't necessarily going to accept the conflict narrative, but what they do accept is the harmony thesis between science and Christianity.
Yes.
As a historian, I can't say that that is the case either. So,
No.
as a historian, we take the view because there's no real way to even define what science is necessarily, because it's been different things throughout history. So the idea that this harmony thesis between science and Christianity is a thing doesn't really work necessarily. But Christians tend to adopt that. So apologists will, tend to adopt that view. And Peter Harrison, once again, argues in his book, which is a really good book, it's called The Territories of Science and Religion, that a modern understanding of religion as beliefs and creeds only develops at the Protestant Reformation. And our modern understanding of science and systematized knowledge of the natural world develops in the 19th century. So it's not really, he argues that linguistically, it's not even really possible to talk about a relationship between science and religion before the 19th century, because science hasn't been defined in the way that it is in the 19th century. Certainly in the Middle Ages, you can't really do that. At best, you could talk about a relationship between philosophy and theology, because those were probably more accurate definitions that were used for that up until the 19th century, quite literally. So there's a danger for Christians themselves in going too far the opposite direction. And so I sometimes, well, a lot of the time, I see, Christians or scientists sometimes say stuff like science is a gift from God. And as a Christian myself, but as a historian, I kind of recoil, because for me, it's like, what do you mean by that? I'm not really sure what you mean by that. I would rather put it, speaking as a Christian, that science or the ability to do science is a gift from God, as opposed to science itself is a gift from God. Just because in the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have talked about science. In the kind of in antiquity, they wouldn't have talked about science. And one of the problems that one of the other things I would say that is a problem that Christians maybe do have is also we tend to locate the origins of science to the Protestant Reformation as well. And we talk about how in this period, when we're trying to combat the conflict narrative, we'll talk about how science was developed in a Christian worldview, the 17th century, which all of this is very much true, but it is exclusionary in the sense that it doesn't it often actually excludes the Catholics before, who were doing excellent science. Again, referring to Seb Folt's work and James Hannam and all the other historians who've done work in that area. It also excludes Eastern Orthodoxy. We don't know much about that side of Christianity and science. And another thing with that narrative, as much as there is truth to it, it does also exclude females. I mean, if you want to talk about Christian females or non-Christian females, that narrative usually, when we hear about people like Newton and Kepler and Boyle, obviously notice that they're all males, white European males, and that as much as that is true, it does kind of leave out a lot more of the story. And I think now historians are starting to kind of pick up on that and push beyond that. So we're trying to now take a more holistic picture of the history of science and religion and all of its complexities. So again, that's the issue, is that it's very complicated, and it's obviously tough for people to kind of keep up with. But I do think it's quite important that as a Christian and as a historian, we're not excluding certain groups as well.
Absolutely, I think that's a really important distinction. about how he defined that, we thank God, praise God for the ability to be able to do science. And I think you're right. It does feel like when you read a lot of apologetics books that suddenly it's like the scientific revolution began.
Right.
And Reformation, scientific revolution, it's this correlation and causation type thing.
Yeah.
And that seems to be very popular in Christian writings. But Christians have been, like you said, the scientific developments ongoing, going back to ancient Greeks and
Yeah.
Mesopotamians and China, Africa.
Yeah.
There's been things that we would consider scientific, exploration. Obviously, like you said, they wouldn't have qualified it in quite those terms, but it was scientific.
Yes.
And it's an important distinction to make. I mean, even go back to Augustine, because Augustine, Christians, like you were saying, it's not necessarily it's not conflict, it's not harmony, it's complex.
Complex.
It is Christians have also, you can point to the scientific revolution, but Christians have always been speaking ignorantly on scientific matters throughout history as well. Augustine talks about people making claims about the natural world that go beyond what the Bible says. It's like just I can't remember exactly. I should have looked this up before, but I'm sure he says something about Christians should be very careful about how they speak authoritatively about the natural world when they don't necessarily have the expertise to do so. Misusing scripture to make scientific claims.
He certainly. That's a good point. Augustine, certainly took the view that philosophy, which was a Greek impetus, not necessarily a Christian impetus, was totally acceptable because the Greeks had discovered quite a lot that Christians hadn't. And so Christians, if Greek knowledge about the world was good enough, and I think the claim was all truth is God's truth. So if Greek philosophers have information about the world that we don't, then we should take that, and we shouldn't make silly claims from the scriptures that might be false if we can get better information from the Greek philosophers. So he certainly took that view, and that view kind of underpinned the medieval period almost essentially throughout. So in terms of like philosophy or natural philosophy, which was a closer term to modern science, at least in that period, as a way of doing or understanding the world. So it was totally fine to do natural philosophy to discover more things about the world beyond necessarily what scripture kind of told us, you could say, or at least in line with what scripture told us.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a lot of Christian. We could still learn a lot from Augustine's wisdom about not making claims that claim to speak or authoritatively about the natural world in light of scripture. I guess an example would be something like young Earth creationism, which remains contentious.
Indeed.
I just quickly, I've got something. I know there's some things we discussed before we started that we want to talk about. I guess just quickly, what would be interesting is what are a couple of these myths about the conflict between Christianity and science, and very quickly, whether that's flat Earth, Galileo, Dark Ages, those kinds of things. I mean, and then maybe like, why they're not necessarily true, or if you're happy to, you don't have to. But it'll be interesting. I think there are things about the flat Earth that that are claimed about today. Christians taught the Earth as flat, and like I said, Columbus thought he was going to fall off the edge of the Earth and things like that. How would you respond? You say a non-Christian says, "Look, hey Nathan, I can't embrace Christianity. I love science and value what science has contributed to the world. I can't embrace something that's in conflict with that."
Yeah, I mean, I guess the common ones, and there's so many of them. First, I'll refer to the people who probably do a lot of the work on this. So Ronald Numbers is one of the kind of pioneers in our field who's done a lot of work debunking these myths. So he's written one book called Galileo goes to jail, and other myths about the history of science and religion, something like that. Another historian called Mike Kies has written a book recently called something like 7 Myths about the History and Future of Science and Religion.
Who's the guy who wrote Slaying the Dragons? I thought that was excellent. Have you
I
read
read that.
Slaying the Dragons? I'm pretty sure it's a Oxford historian of science,
Okay.
and it's fantastic because I've read some of the ones you're talking about with Ronald Numbers, but I found Slaying the Dragons. I'm going to look up while you keep talking. I'm going to quickly look it up quickly,
If you can, yeah.
so I can tell you who it's by while you bust these myths.
I wonder if I know them. I might not, but obviously the classic ones are the Dark Ages myth that science was suppressed by the medieval church in the Dark Ages. Of course, we know that that's not true now, in the sense that the medieval ages, scientific developments were in a sense ubiquitous. So again, Seb Falk would be one of the guys to talk about on this, but he brings out stuff like the astrolabe, which was like the medieval equivalent of a smartphone today. It was this quite amazing astronomical invention that medieval thinkers and philosophers utilized, and he describes it as you basically had the universe in the palm of your hand with this device. And they had, inventions like either they invented these things, or these things were brought into Europe during this period and create and kind of developed even better. So, just general things like gunpowder, paper, spectacles, all of these types of things were, developments. Not to mention the universities, of course, were a development of Europe. Hospitals as well, as you probably know more about this than me. Yeah. Hospitals are very, Christian invention.
Absolutely.
And go back, right to, let's say, the 4th century and onwards.
Well, the Romans are about, because the Romans had hospitals, but they were only for soldiers and for slaves. Right. They never had this idea of the hospital being for the populace, for everyone.
Yes.
It was that's the thing that was particularly Christian. Is it was like Christians like, no, everyone. We're going to care for everyone, not just soldiers and slaves.
Right. No, precisely. Yeah, exactly that. So there's obviously that, as you've rightly pointed out, and as I mentioned, the universities, which institutionalized science, which are science today is practiced in the universities, and there's a whole history to do with that. But also, even stuff like the idea that in the Middle Ages they all believed in supernatural stuff, and they couldn't distinguish that between science is not really true at all. There's a lot of work that's been done to show that it was actually these natural philosophers, people like Thomas Aquinas, in the universities who were actually separating the supernatural from natural and saying that we should be able to describe natural things without referencing supernatural, the supernatural, or miracles, let's say. So that idea is not something that comes in the 19th century. When, let's say, these secularists and atheists stopped believing in miracles or anything like that. It's something that goes right back to 13th, 14th century. So the idea of the Dark Ages is obviously quite a big myth, and obviously I'm not doing justice. You want to speak to a medieval historian who will be the best.
No, I mean, going on that, just what you were saying there is, it's interesting because C.S. Lewis talks about sort of chronological snobbery as we look back at ancient people as these sort of believing anything. I mean, like, when we Christians talk about the virgin birth, it's like they ancient people knew how babies were made.
Right.
Like they knew sex resulted in babies, and actually a virgin birth was unusual. They knew that when people died, they didn't usually come back to life if they were genuinely dead. And it's always it is this sort of snobbery. Is like, oh, silly ancient people. It's like, no, they were not. These were not stupid people.
No,
they were not ignorant people. They knew the fundamental basics of how life is made and when it ends. It's fascinating. What bit about the flat Earth? So, what did Christians ever teach the? Were they teaching the flat Earth? Till 100 years ago, or?
I actually know a lot less about that because I haven't looked in that too much myself. But the general picture that most historians will say is that, of course, Christians never seriously never taught that. Like there was no serious Christian who ever taught that. It was well known since the Greek period that the Earth was round. But what I do know is that was a myth that was invented by a guy called Irvin Washington, I think is his name. It was kind of conjured up for particular reasons. I don't know the full story. This is something that Tim O'Neill would he had this whole article on that. But the general picture I know is that that's not true. In fact, James Hannam, I just recently listened. He's a historian of the medieval period. He's actually writing a book right now where he shows how actually Christian missionaries actually brought the idea of a round Earth to China in the 16th century. And
that's very cool.
Known. Yeah. So I'm actually quite excited to see that his book is about how the Earth became round, so how it became known across the globe that the Earth was round. And so up until then, it was, places like China actually did believe in something more like a flat Earth, but in Europe, no, we rather Jesuits were bringing that information there. So again, that idea is certainly not true. The other classic one is obviously. Was you going to say something?
Well, I was going to say Galileo. I don't know if that was what you were going to talk about. Is that's one of the more popular conflicts that sort of seeped into the public consciousness. But what were we going to say?
I was going to say that.
Oh, well, there you go. Snap.
Yeah, Galileo's case is the probably, apart from Darwin, of course, the most popular case, of course, that everyone will refer to. Again, it's the reason why historians will say complicated is because the Galileo case is actually really quite complicated. It all takes place in the 17th century, so between, let's say, 1605 to 1635. But to understand what was really taking place between Galileo, so he was obviously promoting heliocentrism, which was different from geocentrism, the idea that the Earth was at the center. Heliocentrism being the idea that the sun is at the center, and obviously Copernicus in the 16th century had written a book in 1543 on this. What one has to understand about this is that at Galileo's time, the method for the Catholic Church of doing science wasn't observation and experimentation. And this is one of the key distinctions that one has to first make. So for the medieval period, because of Aristotle's influence, mainly, at least when Aristotle's influence came back during the period of the universities, the main kind of way of doing what we would call science, what was called natural philosophy, was by reading. So it was through books and through logical deduction. So thought experiments, you could say. But the practice of actually observing and experimenting multiple times was not the case, which is why when Galileo observed certain things through a telescope, many people in the church didn't agree with it, because it was a debate about how to do science. It wasn't a debate about science versus religion, because Galileo himself was obviously, well, maybe people don't know, I'm not sure, but he was obviously a Catholic himself. He considered himself a devout Catholic, but he wasn't interested in the method of science that the church endorsed, which was the consensus. And that method had worked perfectly well. Those, throughout the medieval period, many inventions were made. Many things had been discovered, thought about, so forth and so on. But Galileo was interested in this kind of new method of experimentation and observation. So he's discovers that the telescope has been invented, and he kind of designs his own, and he looks out into the stars, into kind of space, and he sees a number of things that Aristotle says one shouldn't see. So Aristotle's kind of worldview, and the medieval kind of worldview, was that there was a terrestrial and celestial region, and the terrestrial region was from everything from the Earth to the moon, and the celestial region was everything from the moon outwards. So basically space. The celestial region was perfect, and it was eternal, whereas the terrestrial region was imperfect. It was the sump of the universe. Everything within that period, within that kind of part of the universe, was not great. And then what Galileo sees, obviously, is that he sees imperfections in the celestial region. So he sees sunspots, craters on the moon, And he also sees stuff like the phases of Venus don't seem to line up with a geocentric view. And so what he's doing is challenging the convention of the time. He's challenging,
Right.
the kind of convention of science at the time, and then it becomes a big case essentially for various reasons. But one of the main reasons, or one of the reasons, is firstly because of that idea of authority and what it actually means to do science. So a question in the church of how to do science. So there's an investigation, of course, in around 1616 into what he's done, and he's told by a cardinal, because you don't have good evidence for your view, you're not to promote your view. In a sense, he was still allowed to hold to it, but he couldn't promote it as if it was.
But was that true? I mean, did he actually have indisputable evidence that his view was right at that point?
But that's the question. It's tough to say, because for many people in the church, yes, he didn't have any good evidence for his view, simply because for them the way that he was looking at his evidence, that utilizing the telescope, was not evidence in itself at all.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge, and that's what I think one has to recognize. It's about the methodology, and so it's what you said is almost not even the right question to ask,
right?
Because it's about what side saw as the right methodology. So for Galileo, he had the right methodology and he had good evidence, although there were still some problems as far as I know some historians have spoken about. But for many people in the church and in the Catholic Church, they didn't see it as good enough evidence. And the evidence that they did have to support their view was just intuition. When you're on the earth, it looks like the sun's moving. It looks like we are standing still. And so that seemed, more plausible. And they weren't obviously bothered with, checking through the telescope, because for them, that's not the method of science that we utilize.
Yeah, that's a really good example, because it's one of those things where it's that chronological snobbery again. It's like, why didn't they just understand it? But actually, a lot of the things that heliocentrism that actually entails are things that are counterintuitive, because if you, like you said, if you look, it feels like you're still and everything is moving around you. You would think, people think, oh, well, the Earth is moving around at thousands of miles an hour. Well, okay, so if I throw something in the air, it should be it should be miles away, but it's not.
It's
so
not.
There's all these things. If you think about, even say about the Earth, it doesn't look round. Does it? If you look up in the sky, you have to go. No ancient person would ever really get to the point where, you want to see the horizon, but it doesn't necessarily look like it's round. So there's all these things that are deeply counterintuitive, that you do actually need substantial evidence to bypass. And I think that's what people forget looking back at Galileo, is perhaps it wasn't actually the case, and you're probably going to talk about this as well, is he didn't really do himself any favors either, did he? Calling the Pope, was it Simplicito or something? Basically, people forget all that stuff. Like oh, this is
you're right. He caused a lot of the trouble himself, indeed. And also, the church didn't condemn. One of the classic things that historians say is that the church didn't condemn him for science. They condemned him in the sense that he broke a law. That if you break a law, of course you're going to be condemned. And that's what he did when he wrote his book in 1632 that promoted heliocentrism, and obviously had that character Simplicico. I think it's
something like that, isn't it?
Who was Pope Urban VIII, who was his friend, and so that was what he was done for. And then the other myths are, he was tortured or he was sent to prison and all that stuff. And now it's known again by historians that stuff, it certainly wasn't. She certainly wasn't tortured. He was threatened with torture, I think, is the best that one could say. But there's no evidence that he actually was tortured. He was actually, during the kind of trial phase, he was put up in the Tuscan embassy, and he got like nice meals and stuff. Like, he was treated pretty decently, actually. And he was put under house arrest. And that was mainly it. It was, this idea of this grand conflict between science and religion is just not there. Lastly, he was a Catholic himself. It just doesn't
Yeah.
up. So yeah, but it's one of those things that people constantly point to.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I've just seen that we've got a question come up, so I'm going to put the question up for you so you can see.
Oh, right.
I'm gonna. I don't know what you want to say. That's Computer Fierce has said for the people listening on podcast that in the future. It says, Nathan, would you say Christian missionaries brought science wherever they went?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I can refer to historians who are working on this more so than me. John Stenhouse in Australia, I think, is the guy that's probably doing some of the most work right now on Christian missionaries. That answer is a yes and a no. They it's actually a really complicated one. But if we do take it from the Protestant period onwards, because that is actually the period where missionary work kind of exploded, it is in one sense very true to say that missionaries were actually some of the first people to bring science, modern science, that is, Western kind of modern science, to other parts of the world. And that's actually one of the examples of obviously bringing the kind of round earth to China, is one example. Another reason why Christian missionaries could be said to be doing this is because they tended to bring a lot of medical science from the West to these other parts of the world, which they were trying to Christianize. So medical science and Christianity actually go quite well together. And so to say that they brought science wherever they went is a complicated one, and I don't think there's been enough studies on that yet to be sure. But certainly there is a good case to say that missionaries did bring a lot of science, Western science, that is, to other parts of the world. Then you run into issues of obviously the empire, cultural issues, different religions, and all of these types of things, which one has to kind of contend with. But certainly missionaries play a big part, and even in science in Europe, many scientists, particularly in fields like anthropology and ethnology, missionaries were like the first point of reference, because to try to understand humans as a whole across the world, the missionaries were the people who had gone out to the rest of the world and had written down the reports of what they had seen. So a lot of the people in my history of science, I look at Britain in the 19th century. A lot of the anthropologists in the 19th century rely heavily on missionaries. Even the secularists, they have to consider missionaries as authorities because some of them haven't been to these places, and so missionary science is actually really important. And I think it's something that's just being more so looked into now. So there's a lot there.
That's interesting. I mean, it's a good question because I didn't realize. I think with medical science, I think I was sort of much more aware of how missionaries did share a more scientific approach to medicine and healthcare to lots of parts of the world. And it's not to say that in some of those places some good things were not being done, and actually in many cases we learned from those places that we
Yes.
went as well. But there was definitely an exchange of knowledge. But I think probably on balance, a lot of those countries did benefit from the knowledge that the scientific and medical knowledge that those missionaries brought. Before I forget, I'm going to look at this book that I'm going to remind you, because if you haven't read it, it is excellent. It's called Slaying the Dragons: Destroying Myths in the History of Science and Faith, and it's by Alan Chapman.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know Alan. I don't know him personally, but I know of him.
Yeah, so he's historian of science at the University of Oxford, I think. So I just about
Okay, yeah.
got that. Great.
That's good.
So that's really helpful. I said so. Please, if people are listening, please do send your questions in, and we'll try and address them. I guess what would be interesting is we didn't. I should have mentioned at the beginning how long you wanted to chat for, how long you're free for. But assuming you were right for another sort of 10, 15 minutes or something, is that okay? Or
Yeah.
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 Then I guess we're interested to talk about some of the things. I know you were talking about. We'll probably connected very much what we just said about this exchange of knowledge between the West and the countries that missionaries went to. Did you talk about race and empire and science, so how these things and history and how these things are connected? I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a topic that I think, at least for me, has really only kind of become of significant importance since last year's events, so George Floyd, COVID. So what's kind of happened, in particular in my field of history of science and religion, but history in general, I think history of science in general, is that there's been a really drastic change in the way that our field does its research. This is not to say that people weren't working on these topics before, but now they've become much more explicit since all of BLM and COVID and the global nature of this all. And so now we're becoming explicit about and this is actually one of the reasons why I said that for Christians, it's a bit dangerous to say that science is a gift from God, because you have to accept the good and the bad that comes with science, right? The colonial aspect of the history of science, the racist aspect of science is there as well. The gendered aspect of science is there as well. So if Christians want to claim all of that, then they have to claim all of it. They can't just claim the good parts of science, the Newtons and the Faradays, and then leave out that other aspect. So that is an important one, because in general, if we look at, let's say, science in the British Empire, at least, a large part of the reason why a large part of the reason why certain sciences could be done was because of the expanse of the empire. So again, going back to anthropology and ethnology, in anthropology, particularly from the 1870s onwards, but even before then, to be honest, Enlightenment period and so forth and so on, it was assumed that Europeans were the most civilized and that any other nation around the world was less civilized. So when you read anthropology works, so Edward Burnett Tylor is probably the main anthropologist in Britain in the 19th century. He writes a book called Primitive Culture, which is really quite infamous in shaping the field of modern kind of anthropology. And the whole idea is that to try to understand human beings and human culture. He's able to get a lot of his information, again, because the British Empire has such an expanse around the world. But the assumption for him and many others is that we are the pinnacle of society, the white European male. And so they judge all other nations, Africans, Asians, people in the Middle East, as lower, as subpar, essentially. And then they draw this kind of history of human development from savage to civilized. And that's how people like Edward Burnett Tylor understand society. And it's a science. Anthropology is a form of doing science, but it has heavy ties to race. He was a racist himself, and many anthropologists were. And so there's things like that one has to kind of reckon with in the history of science, and historians are, I think, becoming a lot more aware of that. Again, not to say that they haven't done so in the past, but it's becoming a lot more explicit now. And then the other thing, very briefly, is just the kind of history in general of race itself. Race science is quite a big part of the history of science in general, which is something that's established, you could say, in the 18th century, second half of the 18th century. And there's this really big debate that goes right from the second half of the 18th century, in line with the Enlightenment and liberal kind of Christianity and all of these things, to kind of the early 20th century, which is a debate between what's known as polygenesis and monogenesis, which, but for people who might not know, polygenesis is the idea that different humans originated in different parts of the world, let's say, so from different stock originally, whereas monogenesis is that all humans come from one stock. And polygenesis is a way to obviously justify racism, is a way to say that there are certain races that are less advanced than other races. There are certain races that are less advanced than other races, whereas monogenesis is a more of you could say originally a biblical view of the kind of unity of all mankind. But even within monogenesis, you can still have racial views. So people like Darwin, who obviously his theory of evolution actually, argued for monogenesis. Darwin was still a racist in the sense that he still held to different racial hierarchies of human beings.
Yes.
So he still held to the view that, the people in Tierra del Fuego, South America, were savage, were animal-like. People in South Africa were animal-like when he went on his journeys on HMS Beagle, and that the European male was, the height of humanity. And Edward Burnett Tyler, I think that's how you say his name, held to a similar view, or they had some differences. And so, you have all of this stuff which complicates, the history of science narrative, history of science and religion in particular, which one has to, as a historian, we have to reckon with all of this stuff. No,
it's fascinating, and how interconnected we all are. And I get one example I was thinking when you were talking about the connection between modern science and medicine and empire is, my own area, especially there is sort of the operating theatre, perioperative care, sort of the operating theatres, is that there's certain drugs that are really key for us to be able to do certain kinds of surgery that were discovered by, almost imperialists in the Amazon basin in South America. Tuberculin is like a muscle relaxant. So, the indigenous people would fire kind of darts that were tainted with this substance that would then paralyze, the animals that they were shot with. And this actually led to, drugs derived from this substance, or what are used today in millions of people's surgeries each year. And we wouldn't actually be able to operate on people because they have to be muscle relaxed, if we didn't have that exposure to that drug. So there's loads of things, and that's just one thing on the top of my head. But you can really see how there's so many connections between empire and
I didn't even know. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Whole host of things. Actually, although I've never studied the history of I did do a top-up degree with the history of empires. So I did my dissertation on slave colonies in Hispaniola, modern Haiti, horrendous stuff. In terms of, that's why, especially, I know we weren't talking about, but in terms of sort of the Atlantic slave trade and what kind of went on. I've read some of the darkest. Some of the darkest accounts of the depths of sin that humans can reduce themselves to. I don't know if you ever heard of a guy called Thomas Thistlewood.
I don't know. I don't think so.
He was this kind of sadistic psychopath, I can only describe him as, and who was a slave trader, who was a slave owner. And you just read like his diary. It's horrifying, the things that they did.
Right.
Yeah, it's it's horrific.
It really is. It's I haven't read that, but when I have read some of the accounts of just like the torture devices and stuff like that, it's like, wow, this is serious.
We human beings have been really cruel to each other throughout history. They really have.
That's Tom Holland's book. He kind of talks about that in the first part, I think, where he talks about Roman culture and Greek culture and stuff like that, how might makes right was kind of the kind of the central world view, and torture and all that stuff was quite normal. And although Christianity has supposed to have transformed that, it's been a difficult thing. And there's that other book called Bullies and Saints, which has just come out.
Yeah, it's a really excellent book. That's
Right.
another one I think we both recommend people
Mm.
Christians read.
Yeah. So yeah,
Um,
it's complicated. That's why I always go back to it's complicated.
yeah, no, it is. It is. That's not what I was here. We want neat, simple
Yeah,
answers to complex questions, and that's just not. It's not viable. You'll never. The truth isn't really attainable.
yeah,
You know, you can't really meet those demands.
yeah.
Yeah. I guess one thing as well. I mean, in terms of your kind of route into the history of science. I know we talked a bit about this before. I mean, there aren't that many, as I know of, when I've sort of, I have a sort of side interest in the history of science. There's not many black scholars in the history of science that I'm aware of. Are you one of the few, or are there others we don't know about? And if not, kind of why not? Have you sort of pondered those questions? I imagine a little bit over the last year or two.
Yeah,
And why are there so few? Do you think as well? Be interesting.
That's a good question as well. It's a bit of a tough one. So I make a distinction between the history of science and then the history of science and religion, because my specific field is a sub-discipline of the history of science. So I work in the history of science and religion in particular.
Right.
And yeah, it's true that that's the case. Part of the reason that you will tend to find, to be blunt about it, white European males, American as well, mostly doing this research, or historically doing this research, is because historically those have been the people that have been privileged enough to do what we call science, and then obviously that brings in all those questions of empire, race, and all of that
class and class as well. It's not, there aren't many working class
yes, that's a good point.
men or women in higher education,
Right, yes, that's a great
so it's that's one of the things that sorry, I'm butting in quickly, but that's one of the things that when I was studying the history of empires, is that people made this generalization about the West, about men, about these rich these men, but these are the most privileged rich people that had probably ever existed, most privileged people up to that point in history. This was not your chimney sweepers, and the people back home were not living glamorous privileged lives. These are people, hardened people living hard lives. You go back to the Victorian age, it was no bells and whistles and sprinkles, living back then. And this is what we often project back. But these, and often the people sent out, were, even most of the missionaries were extremely privileged. Charles Darwin spending his years, on a boat, circling the earth, going to South America, very, rich and privileged. It's not 99% of people. It's this subset of people who had, like you said, had the resources to do these things.
Yeah, man.
And Thomas Thistlewood is a good example of someone from a very privileged background, but was causing damage where he was. So let's send him elsewhere so we can cause damage to people who perhaps we don't think matter as much.
Right.
And there's been a lot of that throughout history as well.
Yeah. No, you raise
so there's a massive class divide. It's just white people, but no, it's this subset of people, isn't it?
That's a good point. Yeah, I should have even mentioned that, because my entire thesis is in a sense about that, because the Duke of Argyll was the top of the class. He was an aristocrat. Apart from monarchy, it doesn't get much more higher than that. And that was essentially part of the reason why he could practice science quite freely, because then people like Darwin as well, as you said, from a wealthy background. The majority of scientists, if we use that label again, that label was invented in 1833. People before then didn't use that term. But the majority of them, certainly from a middle class or upper class background, and so as you rightly said, working class people didn't really get the chance, which is actually interestingly another reason why many atheists and secularists didn't get to participate in science themselves, because they tended to be from a radical lower working class background. And so, yeah, I think you actually hit on something quite useful there, which, yeah, I totally forgot about. But yeah,
No,
very,
no.
very,
So it's just one of those things that seems to get lost now. And again, I'm really interested. The racism is such a massive issue, but
mm,
absolutely should be something that we talk about in terms
yeah,
of race. But class, what often happens is class gets left behind,
yeah,
and that's a really important factor today, but also throughout history as well.
yeah.
Um,
That's excellent. Yeah,
and I think it's much richer realizing the role that social class plays.
I think, yeah, no, 100%. I think that's yeah, totally correct. And then, yeah, to kind of, I guess, get back to.
Yes, sorry, I took us off course there.
Oh no, it's all good. I mean, it's it's that's an important one, to be honest, because it still plays a factor today, in terms of migration. Let's say of let's say from my background, of an African person, and my parents migrated to this country, compared to, let's say, a middle class or upper class person who's lived in this country and might have a relatively decent, well-off background. My parents didn't have that opportunity, so to do something like the sciences, or intellectual, something like history of science,
Yeah.
difficult. My dad doesn't even have a university degree, and my mum was just able to get an undergrad degree. It was very difficult, and she did that when she was in her 50s or something like that.
Wow, good on
So,
her. Good on her.
yeah. So I'm very proud of her, of course, and they've really supported me, I would say, in being able to do this. But you're 100% right. The issue of class, and again, that's also one reason why there might not be as many people, if we limit it, at least in my case, to Africans doing this. Issues of migration, um, um, and then, as I was saying, there's also that whole thing of the history of science itself and the way that it was constructed. It was
Yeah.
constructed to obviously display white, Western European science as science, and anything else was not necessarily science. And so obviously that immediately excludes, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, any other parts of the world that were producing knowledge but wasn't
Yeah.
classified as science. So then what happens with sociologists today who are working on science and religion increasingly now, which is another really interesting thing, that would be worth talking about maybe with a sociologist. They bring out these terms. So there's a sociologist called Kimberly Ross, I think is her name, or Rios rather, and she talks about stereotypical threat and social identity threat, I think, are the two terms.
Right.
Stereotypical threat is the general idea, something like, Christianity and science are in conflict. And what they find is that when Christians hear this, they're actually deterred from doing science. So it actually makes them feel, even if it's not true,
Yeah.
it actually makes them feel like it is true and that they can't do it as well as they should be able to. Social identity threat is the idea that people who don't look a certain way immediately feel excluded from science, because when you read the general history of science, they don't find themselves in it. So then another reason that leads on to the other reason why you won't find necessarily many people doing it is because they don't find themselves in the narratives that have already been written. So again, as I'm doing history of science, I am, more or less studying mainly white people. And I don't say that as a negative thing, but
Yeah.
it just happens to be the case.
Yeah. An
And that's
incident of
partly why.
history.
So then what is happening, what I have noticed is that there are historians of science who are from Africa and other parts of the world. There's not many of them, but they are certainly around. But a lot of historians, let's say, from an African background, from what I've seen, tend to be interested in histories of colonialism, slavery, and
Yeah.
that type of stuff, which makes complete sense, because that's where one finds themselves in the history. They want to
Yeah.
understand where they came from. So the reason why a lot of the history of science has been the way it is because to be blunt about it, is because the kind of European white male dominantly is trying to identify where they've come from, and the history of science is part of where they've come from. But for again, other people of other different backgrounds, because of that, they might not see that. But what they might see is that their history is in the history of slavery or something like that. So they're more interested in those types of topics. But again, this is not to say that you don't find, African historians. There are quite a number of it. I've even just come across one today who I didn't know about. They're around certainly, but for those reasons, there still needs to be an increase, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you're right, because a lot of the historians, the Black historians that I know of, do stuff around history of empire, history of colonialism, history of slavery, those kinds of subjects, which is interesting because you're saying that's sort of situated in the fact that that's the history where they see themselves, and you're right. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, so I guess what you're doing in a way is a response to that, in the sense that as people see you doing history of science, they're seeing people like them, like, I can do history of science. Yes. That's something I can do. But I guess like you said, the other challenge to that is whether you're Black or white or anything else, you're still hearing often this negative cultural message, that there is this conflict, between science and theology. So regardless, you're starting off with this footing that you can't do a very good job at it, because ultimately it's they can't be they can't be wedded together.
Right, they can't coexist. Yeah, no, 100%, and that's certainly the problem. Again, for me, that was certainly one of the issues growing up. I inherently just held to that view, and then secondly, I didn't see many people that looked like me in the field, so not much of an interest. As I say, my interest in it was totally random.
Yeah,
so random.
Well, we have just hit an hour and a half, and we didn't discuss how long we're going to chat for. And so I think an hour and a half is probably all right. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. It's been fun and really interesting. Good. One of the things that we get guests to discuss is maybe a few resources. So maybe like a couple of books that you might recommend people. I know you've mentioned quite a few already, so what I can do, I can always I'll note them down and put a link up afterwards. I know I mentioned Slaying the Dragons, which I've put a link for, I think on the YouTube link, by Alan Chapman. But what maybe another two books you think that someone who is not too technical, someone that's maybe new to the history of science, they found perhaps what you've discussed fascinating and want to find out a little bit more. What two books would you recommend they discuss? They read, sorry.
So there's one obvious book. The only issue is that a new edition is coming out, and I'd recommend that they pick that. But it's called Science and Religion: A Very Short Introduction by Oxford University. Those short
those little ones. Yeah.
So that would be a good one when the new edition comes out, which should be very soon. I'm not entirely sure when. That's a good book, I think, to start off with. It's a bit difficult to pinpoint another one, but maybe Ronald Number's book, which is called something along the lines of Warfare: The Idea That Wouldn't Die. Do you know the one?
Yeah.
It's by
what was the book that's forthcoming by your two?
Of course.
The more reader friendly.
That one's called Of Popes and Unicorns.
That's it. That's the one I've seen. That's the one I'm waiting to read.
Yeah, and that's James Ungarianu and Dave Hutchins. Again, that correct. So those are good books. There's others, but they tend to be a bit more academic. But I could mention if you've got a bit.
Yeah, go for it.
So the kind of core one I would suggest is John Hedley Brooks' book, which is called Science and Religion: Some Historical Perspectives. That's like any historian of science and religion has to read that book. It's like the book
standard text,
right? Yeah, and then the other one is Peter Harrison's The Territories of Science and Religion. That's another excellent book. These are kind of just the standard ones in the field, at least. And then I'll probably just recommend one more, which is an edited collection book. So it has a range of scholars in it, which is called A Rethinking History, Science and Religion, an Exploration of Conflict and the Complexity Principle. And that's by Bernard Lightman, B. Lightman.
Great. Well, I think I've noted down 5 of the 6. I'll need to go and search for that last one. But thank you. That's been really helpful. Is there anything else that you want to say before we finish up?
Yeah, I mean, the only other things which I might say is that our field of science and religion, I think, unfortunately, doesn't have much press. So a lot of the stuff that us within the field know, and I would say that and take for granted, is not widely known in general. But I think platforms like this are actually what are helping, because historically, historians in our field have just written books and written them to other academics. And really now, with the advantage of things like YouTube and podcasts, that's been able to help bring some of this information out more. And also there are a lot more younger scholars, such as myself, but many others, who are also doing this research and are utilizing the kind of internet tools and stuff like that. And they're going beyond the kind of standard histories of science. So one of my friends, Sarah Kidway, she works on science and Islam in the 19th century, which is a fascinating topic because she's bringing out stuff that nobody has really done. So the stuff that she's bringing out is absolutely amazing. So there's certainly new shifts in our field. We've gone past the kind of like debunking the conflict thesis, although we still need to continue to do that. Now we're at the stage where we're trying to go more global, and we're trying to become more intersectional, in the sense that it's not just about science, it's not just about religion, but it's about all of those topics across the globe: science, religion, race, empire, gender, class, disability, political views, anything else I've missed out. That's really where the field, I would say, is kind of going now. And for obviously, from a Christian perspective, then the last thing that I would say is that I think that what the field is doing is quite beneficial to the Christian, if they can come to kind of understand in what ways Christianity has helped with the development of modern science, which I realize is something we didn't actually get to kind of touch on.
No, we didn't really talk about how what it did well.
No, yeah, that's just kind of clocked, but that's totally fine. There's lots of material on that, but the one thing I could say, at least from a general perspective, is that it's certainly true to say that Christianity played an instrumental role in the rise of modern Western science, for various reasons, and that should at least encourage Christians to participate in science more so, or to feel more confident in doing so, because there really is not that idea of conflict, inherent conflict. That idea is just not true. It's totally false.
But just I now got give me a question now. So I mean, if you look back at a lot of those, you look at the science, the history, we talk about the scientific revolution, where we talk about Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, etc. Were these people incidentally Christian, who happened to make big major scientific developments, or was their Christianity actually instrumental to those developments?
Oh yeah, and the latter certainly true. Of course, people will make the argument that everybody was Christian around that time, which is true. But what you have to understand is the question then: why did science, modern science as we know in the West, explode around that period? And the reason was really theological. So, in short, going back to Peter Harrison's argument in a number of the books, his main argument is that the idea of the fall of man was actually what led to the rise of science. So the idea for a lot of these Protestants was the idea that Adam had this kind of Adam in the Bible, so in Genesis, when Adam and Eve, the story of creation, had this what's known as Adamic knowledge about the whole universe, which is why he could name all the animals, and he had this union with God. When they sinned, Adam began to lose that information, and humans began to lose that union with God and that understanding of the universe. So for Protestants, one of the reasons why, science, modern science, I should say, exploded in this period was that very reason of they were trying to reclaim what was known as Adamic knowledge. And the way to do that
Right.
was to become priests of nature, i.e., if we can describe the universe, if we can understand the universe, then we're regaining that knowledge of God, and we're regaining that kind of communication and that unity with God. So that's just one of the reasons. And then there are multiple other reasons as to the rise of kind of science in this period, and you can show a direct link between their Christian beliefs and the rise of modern science, or Protestant Christian beliefs, let's say, and the rise of modern science. So yeah, that's just one of the reasons.
Interesting, because I think that's often one of the criticisms that people just say it's sort of an accident of history rather than being any sort of causal reason for modern science developing at that particular point in history. So I do think that's quite an important thing. It's got me thinking. Go on. No, go on. You go.
I want to make sure I add one more, actually, which I do think is important. I'll try and be brief with this. This is another reason for this kind of rise of science, is one professor in my department in UCL mentions in his book called Thrifty Science. And it's this idea of thrifty science, which was also very common in the early modern period, so 17th and 18th century England, he argues, but you can extend this kind of to Europe as well. And what he argues is that experimentation was just a common part of the everyday thing that people did, and this includes women as well. So the household was a place of experimentation, because laboratories and universities and all that stuff, or laboratories in general, were not really a thing for science until the 19th century. So prior to then, experiments were done at home. So most of these figures that we think about, Newton, Boyle, so forth and so on, they were doing most of their experiments at home, but so were their sisters, so were their wives, so were their kids. And this, I think, the reason why I want to bring this up is because, again, it brings in another aspect that historians usually don't talk about, which is how females and children, sisters, and all those people also helped with the rise of modern science. So this concept of thrifty science, and it came, and the reason why it links to Christianity is because the idea that he points out is that the idea was that everything that we have comes from God. So scriptures like I think it's First James 17, which says every good and perfect gift comes from above, and it was those ideas that shaped this experimental nature. So we shouldn't waste objects that we have in the home, but rather we should experiment on them and utilize them as best as possible. So you might have an object for one use, and you might convert it into a second use and then a third use.
Right.
Instead of now, where we have like a plastic cup and we'll use it and we throw it away. In the early modern period, Simon Warwick would argue that people didn't throw things away as we do today. They would repurpose it or reuse it.
Right.
That was the idea of thrifty science, but it goes back to a Christian root. And then some shifts happen in the 19th century. We become more specialist and we start throwing things away with the industrialization. But that also leads to specialist science in the 19th century. So that's another thing I would like to point out.
No, that's interesting. I've never heard of that that idea. So that's I'll have to look into that a bit more. It sounds fascinating. The one thing I didn't again, another book plug here. Have you heard? Have you read Rodney Stark's book For the Glory of God?
I haven't read it, but I've heard a lot about it.
Glory of God, how monotheism led to the Reformation, science, witch hunts, and the end of slavery. And that's fascinating. And he's a sociologist by training, but I think, I think he's a historian. I think he isn't, but he writes he's a fantastic historian as well. So that's one that's definitely worth. That's one I've reread a couple of times as well, and that's a fascinating read. But
that's interesting because weirdly enough, historians actually critique that now.
Really?
Yeah. So one of the issues with the book is that he places he does that. He makes the mistake of placing too much emphasis on Christianity.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That is fair.
Yeah.
I think he's probably, if I'm right, at least his more recent writings, he has been a little bit more tempered on that. But yeah, I would agree that I think that is a, and I think that's where a lot of the stuff on apologetic. I think a lot of people read Rodney Stark and took that as right. This is the standard view. Whereas what you're right in terms of it's a little bit more nuanced. So I think that's absolutely fair. But I think a lot of what he said, I think that book is still, even with that said, I think it's still a really interesting book to read, at least as a counter point to a lot of the silly historical claims that have been made.
I need to read myself,
but no, I definitely read Slaying the Dragons. I reckon you'll find that you'll really enjoy that. That's a really well. I can't think of any criticism. That's a fantastic book. But great. Well, I think we're an hour and 45. I would be happy to chat for long, but I think it's 9:45. We're both. It's getting a bit late. I've really enjoyed chatting with you, Nathan. It's nice to get to chat with you if not in person, on screen.
Yeah. You too.
And I'm sure we'll have to do this again. We'd love to have you back on. I'm gonna switch to seeing screen and just close up. So thank you everyone for listening in. Please subscribe, share your video. Thank you again to our Patreon people that support us via Patreon that allow us to stream via StreamYard. That we're really thankful for that. We've got some really good guests coming on in the next month, running up to Christmas. So we look forward. We'll be putting some more information on that soon. And thanks again for your questions. And enjoy the rest of your evening. And we'll catch you in a couple of weeks. All right. Take care. And thanks again, Nathan. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.